Hello everyone. This game that I'm going to look at today is from round one of the Sharjah Masters. It's not a big, um, you know, tournament filled with top players, but there's some IMs you may not have heard of, and some GMs around 26, 2700. And I saw a game today by GM Adhiban who played I think he played in one of the top GM tournaments this year, making like his debut, and he did pretty good in the tournament. Here he's playing with the white pieces against an international master by the name of Swayams, who's rated 2450. All right, so let's just run through this game, and I'll try to explain some things the best I can. So we have D4, Knight f6, Bishop G5, and Trompowsky. You don't see this too often. Carlsen tried it in his match versus Karyakin. But as in most of these queen pawn openings, when you open up d4, um, usually you are fighting for these uh, this central pair of d4 and e5 primarily. Of course, you would like the entire center, but your first goal is usually to go after this pair in the center. Bishop g5 kind of um, fights against the analogous plan by black, which is to fight for these squares, right, in the queen pawn openings. Okay, so bishop g5 is putting that indirect pressure on the center. e6 is one of the many ways to play against this opening. Knight f3, so we see just normal development. Um, and knight f3 is more in sync with this move d4 as far as the plan of attacking on the dark squares. d5, you see black continues with his opposite plan, playing on those two squares. e3, okay, the bishop is out of the chain. This is the pawn chain. The bishop is not blocked back here. The bishop is out. So white closes it up and plans on playing bishop d3. Just real simple chess. And this is called getting a position, ladies and gentlemen, just a playable chess position. This is not highly theoretical. And these are the type of openings I should suggest that all beginning players play. Don't get caught up when you're first learning chess and studying openings and all of this theory. Learn how to play chess. Believe me, if you study your endings and tactics, and then you play a simple opening like that, you will be very strong. You will beat players with these quote unquote non-theoretical or simple openings. c5. All right, so just attacking the center. So now we see black attacking um, White's idea, his stronghold on the dark squares. And usually, my friends, that's how most of these openings work, is that you're told in a lot of opening books that yes, you're attacking the center in the opening game, which is true. But you don't attack the entire center all at once, right? You don't have enough moves to do that. Usually the way it works is you attack certain aspects of the center. So you might be attacking just two squares or fighting for two squares, and then you switch to the other two, this being the center. So we saw in the opening that black established the fight here when he opened up with his queen's pawn. The fight for d4 and e5 primarily. And then black did the opposite thing in fighting for d4 and e5, and black did the opposite in fighting for d5 and e4. Okay, and once that's established, right, the grip there is established, then each player starts playing to tear down the opponent's part of the center. So right now we see with c5, and this is why it's so important, because it attacks the black central stronghold. And if black, of course, if white loses that stronghold, then black is able to equalize. And that's basically the fight for the center. And you can look at any opening and figure out what squares are being fought for and such, and that will shape, where your ideas and where you put your pieces and so forth. C3, fortifying D4, which in turn continues to keep a grip on the E5 square. H6, bishop H4, so the bishop wants to stay there. But what H6 does also in moving this bishop back is sometimes the queen will come out here and challenge this pawn. And a lot of times this pawn will still be on E2, and that after H6 and the bishop goes back to H4, then the queen can jump out here without worrying about this bishop just returning here. That's a tactic you often see. Knight C6, again, more pressure here. So we saw again the fight. Keep clicking the E6 square. Again, we saw the fight from black with on these two squares, the establishment of his forces to fight for these two squares in the opening, and now we see the transfer to now he's attacking white's dominance over the dark squares. So knight C6, knight BD2, and of course white is doing the same thing. These are squares that black is trying to dominate. Queen B6, there it is. So we see the attack here. But again, more importantly, there's more pressure being put on D4. So it's very hard for white to try to push E4 or C4 because of the pressure that's being leveled against the white center. And we could say this position is equal. Rook B1, bishop E7. So finally the pin of this guy on H4 is broken. Bishop D3. Again, we see the battle for this E4 square is very important. You see now white has two pieces there, and he's trying to work it out where eventually he can get E4 in. He would love to be able to do that. And we see black has two pieces guarding the square. But the good thing about having the bishop here on H4 is that when it's convenient, he can snap this guy off. All right. And black is trying to do the same thing, is engineer this move E5. Okay. Because if he wins the battle of the center, then he would have a nice advantage in the position. Castle. Castle. Rook E8. Now D takes C5. Now this is an interesting move because I just told you, hey, white is fighting for the dark squares. Okay, in the center. So now he gives up his center. So usually when that happens, it's for some type of tactical reason. All right. And you'll see that white is not really giving up the control of this square, at least in his mind. So watch what happens. Queen takes C5 and now B4. Now the idea behind B4 is if queen takes C3, then black is lost after rook B3. There's nowhere for the queen to go. Therefore, he just simply goes back. Now, here, I believe that white was probably better off in playing a plan like bishop to G3 and B4, followed by knight into E5, whereby he still maintains control over those squares even though he doesn't have a pawn on D4. Okay? So, for example, bishop G3, queen D8, B5, knight A5, and knight E4, and you see the control is still with white on the dark squares. For instance, bishop D6, of course, black will try to fight for it. and the game will continue. Moves like knight f3 if possible, and etc. Even f4, even though that looks kind of weakening. Okay, so to me, that's the proper continuation after giving up the center, quote unquote, with d takes c4. However, Grandmaster Adhiban decided to, after b4, queen d6, he played queen e2, which I wasn't too sure about, because it seems like here now black can just play e5. Okay, so I looked at that. I was like, wow, it seems like he can just play e5. But I guess up his sleeve, this move, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, right? Then e4, because you wanted to weaken black's influence over the e4 square. Knight e7. And then, let's say rook bc1, for example. And after rook d8, I think black is just perfectly fine. Black's bishop now can come out freely as this diagonal has been open, and then it's easy after that to put this rook on c8, attacking this backward c pawn. So this, to me, is an example of black's opening desires and strategy triumphing over white's here, because in this variation we see that white loses his grip on the d4 square. And again, in any campaign, in the opening, if you start out and you know, take control of a certain group of squares and then you lose that control, usually the opponent becomes better. And we can see that in this variation, that white is taking over e5, right? And is also contesting d4, right? These are squares that white once had under control, and black still maintains his control over his d5 square, and he's still contesting e4. In other words, white has not taken control over that square as of yet. So that's how I felt. Black should have definitely, I'm sure he considered it, but I think he should have played e5. That seems like the logical move there. I mean, all your pieces are set up for that push. Okay, and after d takes c5 earlier, that's what you should be playing for. So, not that this was a bad move, but I believe that this idea was okay with b4. This was okay. The follow-up, however, should have went something along these lines. And you can see white still maintains that grip. Okay, but even after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, you can still contest this square. Black maybe moves like that. Possible. What else? Bishop d6. And there's a lot of play still in the game. e5 is yearning to be played. And the only thing that might stop e5 here or pause it for a second is a move like c4, putting pressure here. So for instance, e5, then c5, but still the game is equal at best. White has his 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side, but this center is very powerful for black. Okay, so the center is basically, to me, the theme of this game is the proper play in the center. And black had his chance there. Okay, back to the game. So Adhiban played queen e2, and I felt this was the time. Okay, instead, Swayams, International Master Swayams, went for some trades here. Now, You see this a lot in Queen's Pawns openings, this trade of the dark square bishops. But if you just look at the position logically, most of the important central pawns are on light squares for black. This makes the dark square bishop for black his quote unquote best bishop or his good bishop. Okay, the c8 bishop is his problem child, right? Or bad bishop. So to play knight h5, I know you're a little cramped and want to trade some pieces down, but to me, this is good for white. This is a good exchange for white. Okay, because now after trading off that good bishop, which often serves as a good defensive piece in the queen's gambit, now it's gone, and now the queen must watch over the dark squares. Okay, so that to me that helped white, and then the bishop that he's left with still needs to be freed. Okay, so now to me after this move, Adhiban starts finding his way. Look at what he does. B4. Why B4? Well, of course he's attacking the knight, but more important than that, he's fighting for the dark squares. He understands I can't. He understands I can't allow E5. Plays B4 to indirectly fight for the center. Knight A5. So now the knight is on the rim. Knight on the rim is dim, right? Not meaning it's not too good. And look, you see, still fighting for the center. 16 moves into the game. Of course, there's this threat here to this knight. And so I hope you can see that this move knight h5 wasn't too good, because you see what happened, whose position improved immediately afterward. It was white's. Right after bishop takes e7, we saw the knight driven to the side, and we see this knight on h5 on the rim, right? Both knights on the rim attacked, and we see white strengthening his grip over the e5 square. And by the way, if black wants to remove white from the e5 square, the white knight that is, how is he going to do it? He has to play f6, which weakens his g6 square. Okay, because this knight on a5 is no longer able to return to c6. Knight returns home. f4. Okay, again, let's reassess the position. Right, I talked about the dark square strategy. You see that with your own eyes now, that black has gotten a good grip on the dark squares. Excuse me, white has gotten a good grip on the dark squares. So we see all of this going on. Let's talk about the light squares now. Again, in the opening for black, he was concentrating on these two squares right here. So he has his pawn established on d4. However, he wasn't too successful in getting e4, because as you see, e4 is contested. In other words, if he was to throw his knight here, it would be captured and he would just drop a pawn. Okay, so he didn't win that battle. Okay, white won his battle, and black didn't quite win his. All right, and therefore white has an advantage in this position. Also, even though black is cramped and little behind in development, his position is pretty solid, and you get this type of thing going on in a lot of these Queen's Gambit decline structures, and Slav structures and such, where black is very solid, as far as his pawn structure, but he lags behind in development and space. All right, so if we look at white's pawn structure, it's not too good. Okay, it looks very loose. However, it doesn't matter if white has a lot of piece activity to compensate for it. And as we can see, white's pieces are very well placed for attack. All right, this compensates for the looseness of white's pawn structure. All right, another thing to notice about black's position is the lack of prospects. Right, he's having trouble developing his pieces, and if you look at his pieces, they're pretty bad. Look at the rook on e8, it's not doing anything. Rook on a8, still asleep. Bishop c8 is still asleep. Knight on a5 is trying to get into another chess game. Okay, the knight on a5 is trying to get into another game. It was no part of this game. Right? If there was another chessboard right next to it, that knight on a5 would just hop off and go to that game. Okay, it doesn't want anything to do with this game. All right. So black has no prospects in the position. So this is what makes it even more dangerous. Because when you don't have a clear plan and objective, it's easy to make mistakes. Everything you do, you have to have an objective. You have to say, I'm playing this move to, whatever, conquer the dark squares, or I want to conquer the d6 square, or I want to play against this weak piece, etc. You have to have some kind of goal. Black, it's hard to play in this type of position. Like if I'm looking at the black position now, I'm seeing moves like b6, bishop b7, maybe rook ac8, and trying to get this guy back in the game with c4. That's basically all I can see. Perhaps trying to get rid of this guy on e5 with the move like knight d7 or something at some point. But it's difficult. Meanwhile, on the flip side, white has a lot of prospects. As you see, f4 has been played, which usually signifies the coming onslaught. Rook f3, moves like that. g4, g5. Basically with queen and h5. Basically with a king side attack. Real easy. This type of opening is cousin to the stonewall attack. All right. So white setup is kind of easy, and black's is a little slow and difficult to implement. Let's move on. So b6, here it is, g4, knight d7. So he wants to get rid of this guy. Like I said, there's not a lot of plans to do in this position. He's just in a bad position. He's making the best out of it. So now he can't even trade that knight off and put the e pawn here because white backed up the knight. Knight takes, knight takes. Okay, so he trades some pieces hoping to diminish the attack, but again, this just shows the poverty of black's position. All these pieces are pretty much junk right now. Bishop b7, g5. It just keeps going on. This bishop is nice here, but is it enough? Finally, black decides, hey, I'll sacrifice a pawn to get rid of this bad knight in the position and at least open up the diagonal here. Bishop takes c4, great move. Notice how he didn't capture with the knight, he captured with the bishop, because now this knight is unopposed here. This bishop can never capture this knight. And the only way you're going to get this knight out is you got to weaken your king side with f6. This knight is very powerful. G takes h6. So now we see the opening of the G file. And notice how good white's position is. That even with the bishop on b7, he can open up the G file because all of the rest of black's pieces are totally inept in the position. Idea is simple. King f2, and then bring the rooks to the open file. Put this guy here, and it should be all over shortly. Queen h5. Okay, so we got a direct attack here. And now here's the moment of truth. What do you play here? Okay, if you move the king away, then you got trouble here. So f6 happened. Just like I said, the only way to get rid of this guy is to play f6, but in turn, you weaken these squares severely. This shows how bad black's position is, because Adhiban just played king f2. The knight can't be taken because of rook g1. The rook g1 check is pretty much all over. For instance, if king h7, then just simply queen g6 check, king h8, queen takes h6 check, queen to the rescue, and that's all she wrote. Mate in one move after that. That's why white was able to just simply ignore the move f6. better move was queen f6, but still just king f2 with the idea of rook g1 coming. So f6 was played, king f2, and now here comes the bishop to the rescue. And what would you play? Everybody that's from 1200 up is going to play rook g1 here, right? Or queen h6. Queen takes h6 is played, and I think that's more accurate, so that the king can't hide right there, of course. So queen takes h6, and I am Swayams, after a hard day at the office, resigned. Again, white was able to ignore this move also, because this rook is totally irrelevant to the position. This, it doesn't matter if bishop captures this rook or not. What's important is this move, rook g1, that is going to lead to checkmate in combination with the knight and queen. So for instance, if bishop takes b1 and just simply rook g1 and there's no defense. Only defense is, those crazy computer defenses where they just give up everything. So for instance, rook takes g6 check, queen, and that's mate. So that was a quick rundown of that game. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something about the central squares, the importance of the center. I try to explain it, in a slightly different way than it's usually explained, and hopefully it's a little bit clearer for you. Like, look at your openings and ask yourself what squares are being challenged by each side. Okay? Because when you say I'm just playing for the center, it's too generic, right? Because you're usually playing for a certain pair of squares first, okay? And then it switches. And then you see every move related to that. Like, for instance, this move bishop g5 in the Trompowsky is indirectly fighting for the center, but what part of the center is it fighting for, right? By challenging this knight on f6, it's fighting for e4, right, and d5, the squares that the knight influences, okay? Now, if I ask you what part of the center is this knight fighting for, well, it's fighting for the dark squares, okay? So usually the way these things work is that you're challenging, you're fighting for some squares that that you're trying to build your game around, and then the other set of squares is basically what the opponent is trying to build his game around. So it's kind of like you set up your stronghold first, and then you try to stop him, and of course he's trying to stop you, and that's why you get this battle of the quote unquote center. But it's, like I said, it's more complicated than just, the center. There's certain squares that's being battled for. So for instance, c5. That's why the move c5 and these e5 breaks are so important in the queen pawn openings, because if black is able to break successfully with c5 or e5, it's usually equal. Okay, and that's why you don't see a lot of these type offbeat type systems at the top levels, because after d4, d5, it's well known that the strongest move is probably c4 here. Okay, because it challenges black's idea and fight for these squares immediately, right? Where white is trying to set up his own thing. And then you usually get this, right? He wants to keep it, but then he makes this little concession here, and then it just goes on and on. Knight c3, etc. Knight f6. And you can see the squares that are being influenced, right? Bishop g5, again, influencing what? These. Bishop e7, knight f3, and these are, and it just goes on and on. Castle, e3, again, e3 supporting d4, which is influencing what? So I hope that you learned a lot from that game. I hope you enjoyed it. As usual, please like and subscribe. And I'll probably be looking at some games from this tournament every now and then. Like I said, it's not a top level tournament, but there's some good games in there. And just be on the lookout because I am going to be focusing on end games um, more in the future. All right, so I'll see you guys on the next video.